What happened to tuner cars? Hey, what happened to tuner cars? They aren't dead, are they? In this video, we are going to dive a little into the history of tuner cars and see if tuner cars are in fact non-existent in today's world. Stay tuned. One, 1990 to 1999. This is the era where people started getting a little creative with their cars. The truth is that modifying cars can be traced back to the 1950s. However, kids in the 90s often inherited cars from their parents and modified them to personalize them. These modifications were mostly done to cars like the Honda Civic, particularly cars with 4 to 6 cylinders in them. This custom became so popular that car magazines focused on car modification arose, like Super Street and Import Tuner. This totally turned into a culture as car events started taking place globally. The NOPI was one of those shows, which drew a huge following in the late 90s. The 90s helped to solidify both the market and cultic following for car modification among young people. The limited choice in cars made many similar and noticeable designs across America. Some of the cars available for this included the Lexus GS, Toyota Supra, and the VW Golf. Depending on where you lived in America, you would see a particular set of these cars. If you were looking to spot around town cars like Supras and RX-7s, then you would need to be in South California. This is because people in the area could afford to buy these cars for their children as the standard of living was higher. The eastern part of the US settled for Japanese cars such as the Neon. Now here are many ways in which the culture exploded towards the end of the 90s era. 1. The magazines related to the car niche got longer. Averaging around 80 pages for each magazine, most publications decided to add up to 200 pages for each issue, which certainly meant that people were enjoying them. 2. There was a rise in the number of exclusive tuner event series in the country. I'm talking about Hot Import Nights, National Import Racing Association, and many more. 3. The late 90s also saw a huge increase in Japanese car distribution in the US. This saw an increase in the availability of car parts as well. Now let's be real, if tuner cars had this kind of impact on the world, why did it disappear? Wasn't this a world changer for the vehicle market? We'll get there. Let's move on to the 2000s. 2. Years 2000 to 2010. Now, the beginning of the 2000s was the height of the tuner market and culture. If you were around then, you'd probably never imagine a world where tuner cars weren't a thing. We are now in 2021, and the car tuner market is booming, and Universal Studios decides to take advantage of this by producing a movie that would take over the world, The Fast and the Furious. More magazines in this niche were being created as more people got into blog posts on tuner cars. As you can imagine though, the internet was booming, and these blog posts and online information would certainly get rid of magazines. The magazine industry was still keeping its head above the water, but this marks a period where even the great magazines fell off. Some were sold to bigger organizations. The US also suffered an attack to its towers, which brought the economy down, making it harder for more of these cars to be purchased, and this was followed by a bad recession. This means that there were less advertisers for the car tuner industry. I'm not talking about small losses, but millions of dollars lost in advertisement revenue. At this point, it was cheaper to advertise in a magazine than a website, and social media did not make things any easier for the industry. Another thing that interrupted the tuner car culture was the rise in drifting. This did not only steal the eyes of the public, but advertisers too. But you also have to understand that most people who tuned their cars in the 90s are at this point older, and most have families. This means that they had to find better options for transportation, since tuned cars did not make good vehicles for families. Because of the huge interest that was experienced by the world in the late 90s and early 2000s, the government started paying attention, and soon more strict laws were implemented. This causes more people to opt less to change their engines, turbos, and builds. The car manufacturing industry also started making cars more complicated, making it hard for people to modify them. the events started having a bitter taste to them, as promoters were viewed as arrogant and exploitative people in the industry. This caused a lot of shareholders in some of these events to bow out of the industry. Now we are now in 2007, hoping things will improve, and then another recession takes over the US, which was more dreadful than the previous. At this point, people were opting for cheaper parts for their cars. This caused a huge decrease in genuine car tuners. Because people weren't willing to pay enough for original and good quality parts for tuning their cars, companies that provided these parts started falling into the idea of creating cheaper parts. Since then, this has only gotten worse. This might have been viewed as the last nail to the tuner industry. Some manufacturers started replication tires as well. The people who bought these cheap parts were smiling. The tuning culture wasn't. Instead, it was dying. 3. 2011 to 2020. This is now the age where it seems as though tuner cars are something of the past. Not that they aren't there, but they have lost more of their dignity due to the cheap parts market. But here's the things. The people who tuned their cars during the 90s or even the 2000s are all grown, with cars more suitable for families. However, this does not necessarily mean that their love for tuner cars has died. It's not something you wake up one morning and decide you are coming out of. The original car tuners could now afford more expensive cars, and their tuning style also became expensive. So in this time period, we are not just talking about tuning the Honda Civic. These old-time tuners are modifying Porsches, AMGs, and BMWs. Their maturing taste of cars also evolved the idea of tuning simple cars like the Toyota Supra and onto much more complicated cars. And this soon became a sign of status rather than the culture that it originally was in the 90s. However, their love for cars never died. It's the focus that has changed. As they matured and moved on to more costly cars, they are now placing their focus on things like drifting, lowriders, and classic car restoration. Things became more clear when people started to notice that the companies that produced parts were becoming less over time. This makes it harder to tune your car, and some of the cheap car parts get more costly. Imagine paying for a knockoff brand at a price of the original. This also meant that tuner car events lessened together with the magazine culture. The government regulations made things much worse. There are, however, street takeovers, which are not only part of the reason the tuner culture disappeared, but it still continues to hurt it today. Basically, there has grown a negative view of car tuners, and most car brands today will not provide support for their cars that have been modified in any way. The overall negative perception of the cultures means that governments are still going to make stricter laws to discourage people partaking in these car tuning acts. The press itself is not making things easier for the culture. Today, a sight of over 500 cars and 20,000 people in a tuner car event is what many old people will and miss, and the younger generation will never get to experience today. We cannot deny that there was a time when the tuner car section blew up in popularity, changing the way in which people viewed their cars. But today, all that is simply a memory and a good story to tell. In these shows, you'd find support from brands like Autobots and Art in Motion. They dominated the events, and cars which came from them were the ones that would take most of the cups in these events. This has built memories for others who traveled with their families and spouses to come and view these shows. It was a sport after all. The events would be long and make a good place to get away from the city and work life, and spend the day from the early hours of the morning until midnight. Most fans of the sport enjoyed every minute of it. The sport was generally safe, with few to none rivalry groups and fighting. It helped many people psychologically, as it became something to look forward to, and really, no one thought it would end. It spread like religion, and every lover of the sport felt obliged to convert more people into this fascinating culture. Kids loved it, and it made a great hobby for most adults. Today, taken over by social media, it's clear that the older guys continue to feel sad about the state of affairs and still believe that the culture can rise again under the new circumstances. So, in reality, the tuner cars did not die out. They simply evolved. Whether we like the evolved version of them or not is a story for another day. The new generation prefers cheaper parts and a different way of showing off, and we see much more expensive cars being modified today. At the end of the day, you get to decide whether tuner cars are still a thing. you can do whatever you feel like in your car. Now, I really hope you enjoyed watching this video. Let us know in the comment section below if you think tuner cars will become a thing in the future, or are the remaining cars the last kicks of a dying horse? Remember to like and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this.